Hello everyone and welcome. So it's no secret that I'm a massive fan of the Vampire Chronicles and everything it brings to the table. I love so many of the characters, but when it comes to my all-time favourite, well, for me, that's got to be Lestat De Lioncourt, whose fame began with the Anne Rice classic Interview with the Vampire. This book really spearheaded vampires back onto the scene, and to be honest, the genre hasn't looked back since. Lestat is by far an incredibly written character, from his difficult beginnings with an abusive father to his ups and downs throughout his life as a vampire, how he embraces vampiric nature, and how he is a fantastic example of what happens when a vampire has had enough and says, screw the rules. In today's video, I'm going to cover the entire life of Lestat with reference to his autobiography, The Vampire Lestat, and Interview with the Vampire. I'll cover his tales and experiences in The Queen of the Damned and The Body Thief in a second separate video. So today is just going to focus on The Vampire Lestat and Interview with the Vampire. Welcome back everyone and thank you for the support. Lestat is one of the most recognizable vampire characters in movie, screen and literature history. Although he's had more appearances on paper than the big screen, I think it's safe to say it would be very hard to forget the vampire's magnificent portrayal by Tom Cruise in the movie adaptation of Interview with the Vampire. Even Anne Rice herself, who was strongly against Cruise playing the part, was won over by his representation of the character, and if I'm honest, I seen the movie before I ever read the book. Despite there being several excellent vampire book series, I personally would place the Vampire Chronicles at number 1, as it was basically a template for so many characters' relationships for future sagas and series. I'd put the Vampire Diaries as number 2 by the way, but that is something we'll talk about in another video. Today is all about the most eccentric, flamboyant, vicious, evil vampire to exist, Lestat De Lioncourt. The vampire who was never given a choice, something I'll get to a little later on, in case you've ever wondered why Tom Cruise kept saying that in the movie. Lestat's first appearance comes in Interview with the Vampire, but that is certainly not where his life begins. Like all vampires, he once had a mortal life, but it was definitely not an easy one. He was born on November 7th, 1760 in Auvergne, France. Being the youngest of his brothers meant he had very little prospects, as only his eldest brother would inherit their father's land. He was a very quiet child but did not want to languish with no prospects. Lestat was then sent to a monastery to be properly educated. He liked it so much that he decided he wanted to join the order as a brother. His father and his older brother would not accept the boy making such a pledge and physically dragged Lestat from the monastery, ending his education permanently and before he could properly learn to read and write. This devastated Lestat as he was left illiterate, meaning his prospects lowered even further, and it did not appear like he was going to make much of his life. When a band of travelling Italian actors came to his village to put on a show, Lestat completely fell in love with acting and everything it represented. He was determined to become an actor and left with them the next morning. This was extremely short-lived however, as his father and brother followed him to the next town. He awoke alone, only to find them there waiting to take him home. Once again, Lestat's father interfered with something his son wanted to pursue, and the boy only grew more resentment towards him. By the age of 21, Lestat could only write his name and some prayers he'd learned from the monastery, but he could not put sentences together. He was then asked by his local villagers to slay the wolves that kept coming into the area, and with the help of his mastiff, impressively, Lestat slay all 8 wolves. This led to an encounter with a man named Nicolas de l'Enfant, who happened to be in the area when Lestat had killed the wolves. Lestat's mother Gabrielle encouraged their friendship and, knowing how controlling her husband had been over her son's life, also pushed him to leave with Nicolas when they had the chance to do so. When the opportunity did come up to leave, Lestat went to Paris with Nicolas and gets a job as a backstage assistant in a theatre. He's so well liked and appreciated that he eventually works his way into the show as an actor and is hailed for his performances in the 3rd and 4th acts. That was all he ever wanted. what he had dreamed of. Lestat was happy. His life could not be more perfect. That was until he began noticing a mysterious white face in the audience that is continually watching him show after show. He's kidnapped by this mysterious face, who then turns out to be a vampire named Magnus and is held prisoner until Magnus concludes that Lestat is the one he will make into a vampire as his one and only fledgling. It appears evident that Magnus had been contemplating creating a successor for some time, judging by the amount of decomposing, blonde-haired, blue-eyed men in his cellar, Lestat being the one to finally make the grade. Magnus had grown tired of life as a vampire. He had lived for over 300 years and did not wish to continue being immortal. He refused to make any more of his kind as he believed it was a curse, and when the time was right, he would create one and only one fledgling. Lestat had no say in the matter. He was chosen and the dark gift was forced upon him. This is where I believe the "choice I never had" line comes from. Lestat wasn't given the choice to die, something he offered to Louis.
If I leave you here, you die. Or you can be young always, my friend.
Magnus informs Lestat that he will commit suicide and leaves him with some basic self-preservation rules. He does not tell Lestat about vampire history, where they come from, how they came to be, how to use his gifts, nothing.
I know absolutely nothing. I wasn't given a choice, remember?
The young vampire was left to fend for himself. One of the dark gifts bestowed upon Lestat after his transformation is the power to read minds.
Read your thoughts.
Something he rather enjoys. He also has the power to entrance his victims, forcing a calmness upon them. In addition to that, Lestat is incredibly strong, powerful, and extremely agile. He also inherits Magnus's riches, which gives him a decent level of comfort. Being Magnus's only fledgling in 300 years, Lestat gained his power due to his creator's strength not being diluted, but passed on to him. With the money he had inherited from Magnus, Lestat purchased his beloved theatre he had performed in, and began to distance himself from his mother and Nicholas due to them both being mortal. Lestat tried to resume his old life, acting in the theatre, putting shows on, and for a short period of time, things seemed to be okay. That was until he genuinely frightened the audience with his supernatural abilities during one of the shows. Fearing a backlash, he shut the theatre down. Realizing he can't return to a normal life, Lestat feels the urge to embrace life as a vampire instead, hunting the streets of Paris and learning everything he possibly could since he was taught so little. Sometime after establishing himself as a vampire, Lestat's mother Gabrielle arrives in Paris looking for him and informs him she is dying of consumption. Knowing his mother will surely die without his help, Lestat reveals his vampiric ways and transforms his mother into an immortal, saving her. He teaches his mother what little he knows, and the two hunt successfully for the next 6 months, but Lestat can't help but feel an overwhelming presence surrounding his every step, as if he's being watched, which makes him very uneasy. This presence reveals itself as a coven of Satan-worshipping vampires. They pursue Lestat and Gabrielle for reasons unknown to the two vampires. Things come to a standstill when the coven chase and surround them outside the church of Notre Dame. They won't enter, but a young-faced vampire appears and actually does follow them in. This is the vampire Armand, leader of the coven. Armand tries to convince Lestat and Gabrielle to leave the church willingly and come outside to talk. When they refuse, he then threatens Nicholas's life unless they do so. This angers Lestat, but he and his mother comply. The two are taken to the coven's lair in an old cemetery. While there, they are scolded and labelled as traitors to the vampire race for not living by the strict code that every other member of the coven adheres to. However, Lestat does not lie down when it comes to such derogatory treatment. He argues back, stating that living in a dark cemetery hidden away is no way for a vampire to live. Lestat states it's pathetic, and worshipping the devil for nothing in return is completely pointless. Why should vampires live in the shadows when they are the ones with the power? The Coven's vampires begin to resonate with Lestat's reasoning, which infuriates Armand. The escalating conversation results in the two engaging in battle, and Armand is completely shocked at how strong and powerful his opponent truly is. Lestat defeats Armand without exhausting effort and literally destroys every belief Armand had established amongst the Coven, harming his authority over them also. The next night, after they leave Paris, Nicholas pleads with Lestat to turn him into a vampire. Despite Lestat protesting against it, there is no way of knowing how the dark gift will affect each individual, but Lestat eventually relents and transforms his friend. He described turning Nikki as one of the worst moments of his life, as he could feel all of his friends' inner darkness. As he feared, being a vampire did not sit well with Nicholas. He became unstable and inconsiderate of others. His emotions and inner torment were clearly evident, as he didn't even care about concealing his existence as a vampire. With his concerns growing, and Nicholas now refusing to even speak, Lestat goes back to the old flat they lived in and retrieves his Stradivarius violin, thinking it would cheer Nicholas up. Before he arrives at the flat, however, the vampires of the Satanic Coven find Lestat and plead for his help. They explain to him that Armand has been burning vampires alive and needs to be stopped. Lestat agrees, but first says he wants to retrieve the violin. He finds Armand in the flat, attempting to gather as much information as he can on Nicholas. Lestat is disgusted at him and leaves, with no intention to ever cross paths with Armand again. Lestat then takes Nikki and his mother to see his solicitor so he can get all of their affairs in order. Nicholas, without warning, fled from them both and disappeared into the night. It was becoming evident that his mental state was now deteriorating. Lestat and his mother track him to the theatre he once owned. There, he finds Nikki playing his violin aggressively and rather unpleasant, but the vampires in the theatre begin to dance. Nick scolds Lestat and tells him how much he hates him and demands that Lestat give him ownership of the theatre for ruining his life, to which Lestat reluctantly agrees. Nicholas names the building the Theatre of Vampires. For those of you who never read the book, The Vampire Lestat, and only seen the interview movie, then you'll recognise that this is the theatre where Armand and the others perform a vampiric act on the innocent girl who pleads for her life, but pretends as if it's a show. Louis sums it up quite well in the movie when he says, "Vampires pretending to be humans, pretending to be vampires." Nicholas would be warmly welcomed by the vampires of the theatre, but would quickly become even more erratic with his behaviour. Like Lestat's creator Magnus, he would demand to have his own funeral pyre created, and afterwards plunge himself into the flames, committing suicide. Lestat's wish of never crossing Armand's path again doesn't last very long when the two meet while out at night. Armand appears friendly to him, creating a false sense of friendship. This was only to get close enough to Lestat to drink his blood in order to gain more power. It's important to understand that Armand is still in the body of a 17-year-old boy, so he's not 100% developed into an adult and never will be. Lestat resists and overpowers Armand, beating him endlessly until he takes a moment to look at how desperate and alone that the boy is. He takes Armand back to the tower and listens to the story of his creation. This begins Lestat's fascination with Marius, a 2,000-year-old extremely powerful vampire who could have all the answers Lestat had been searching for. He writes a message in stone, more like a calling to Marius, asking him to find him. He goes without answer from Marius for the next 10 years as he travels with his mother. They part ways for good when Gabrielle withholds a letter from him that contains information of their family member's demise, all except his father, that is. Lestat had become disillusioned with life as a vampire. Unwilling to withstand the current climate, he buries himself underground and slumbers with the hope that one day Marius will answer his call. When that day actually comes, and Marius revives him, he gives Lestat his ancient blood to strengthen him even further. He then takes him to his private island where Lestat is completely in awe. He'd waited so long for this moment, and now he can finally get the answers he seeks. Not long after their arrival on the island, Marius takes Lestat to see those who must be kept, Onkill and Akasha, the first ever vampires. I'll be making a video on them in the near future, but to give you a rough idea, Onkill and Akasha lost their bloodlust and became living, marble-like statues, cared for by Marius for over 2,000 years. Their vampire powers and mannerisms were actually from a demon that lived within them. Only by creating more vampires could they spread the demon out amongst these new vampires and regain control over their bloodlust and themselves. Back to the story. Marius has to leave the island to attend to personal affairs, but before he leaves, warns Lestat not to enter the chamber. Lestat at first listens to Marius, but he can't ignore the overwhelming call to visit those who must be kept. He enters the chamber and wakes Akasha and Onkill. He drinks from Akasha and she drinks from him. However, Onkill attacks Lestat in a jealous rage and is about to crush his skull, until Marius returns at the last moment to save him, threatening to take Akasha away if he kills Lestat. Onkill is extremely powerful and his rage is still evident. Marius instructs Lestat to leave the island as his life is still at risk. Lestat reluctantly agrees and travels back to New Orleans, where he comes across an individual by the name of Louis de Pontulac. Lestat falls in love with Louis and turns him into a vampire. Louis allows Lestat to move into his plantation home along with Lestat's dying father. As they settle, Lestat still refuses to talk to his father due to the years of abuse he endured. As his father's condition worsens, he tells Louis to end his life, which Louis reluctantly does. Lestat struggles to convince Louis to embrace his vampiric nature, but eventually realizes that the beauty of Louis is the fact that he retains a large part of his humanity. After some time, the vampires begin to arouse suspicion, only appearing at night, no sign of them during the day. The slaves begin to rise up and eventually drive Louis and Lestat away from their home. They travel to the Frontier plantation, outside the city, a place of which Lestat is familiar with as he killed the owner, but it was a short stay as they could not settle comfortably. They soon head back to central New Orleans, where Lestat resumed his merciless killing spree, which forced more resentment towards him from Louis' standpoint. Lestat comes to the realization that Louis may very well leave him. He despises Lestat for making him what he is, a soulless killer. Lestat genuinely loves having Louis as a companion and doesn't want to lose him at any cost. One night, he comes across Louis feeding on a 5-year-old girl, Claudia, who had been residing in a plague-ridden derelict home. He mocks Louis for his hypocrisy, but in a desperate attempt to get Louis to remain by his side, Lestat turns the dying little girl into an immortal child. The guilt of almost killing Claudia, followed by Lestat saving her life, causes Louis to remain by his side. The three become a family and care for Claudia as she begins her life as a vampire. However, as Claudia's mind and intellect grow, her body does not. Trapped in the body of a 5-year-old, she develops a deep resentment towards Lestat and eventually comes to hate him for making her what she is, just as Louis does. For 65 years, she lived as a vampire in a child's body, and things finally come to a head between her and Lestat. She tricks Lestat into drinking dead blood and then kills him, or so she believed. She and Louis take Lestat's body to the swamp and dump it there, unaware that Lestat was still alive. He manages to survive the swamp, feeding on cold-blooded animals for the minimal energy it gave him to pull himself out. He also credits Akasha's blood playing a major part in his survival. Although he was still alive, the attempt on his life weakened him severely. He no longer had the power he once had, and had it been any other vampire, they would not have survived. When attempting to gain revenge on Claudia and Louis, he was set alight and horrifically burned, fire being extremely deadly to vampires. Once again, this should have killed Lestat. We've already seen 2 examples in this video alone of vampires committing suicide by fire, so it really does highlight just how beneficial it was for Lestat to not only have Akasha's blood, but also Marius's blood. Louis and Claudia flee to Paris, believing him to once again be dead, but could not be certain. Little did they know that Lestat had ideas of his own. He visits the theatre he once owned and asks Armand for help. In exchange for his help, Lestat has to openly admit that the person who attempted to take his life was Claudia, as the vampires wanted her dead anyway for being far too young. Armand then lures Lestat to the top of the theatre's tower under false pretenses. He tells him both Louis and Claudia are now dead before dropping the facade, accusing Lestat of ruining his life when he made all of the beliefs Armand had established seem obsolete, in addition to defeating him in front of his coven. He easily overpowers Lestat due to the latter's weakened state and throws him off the tower, leaving him severely injured. With it being so difficult to hunt without being discovered, it took Lestat 2 full years to gain the strength to be able to recover to the point where he could travel back to America. When he does, he spends the rest of the 19th century alone in isolation, feeding on rats, with no will to want to do anything but merely exist. Armand visits several times, but Lestat just ignores him, although he could always hear him when he arrived. Lestat continued his isolation until he feels rejuvenated by the sound of a rock band. He vows to become the vampire he once was. If that's a story you want to hear, then please comment down below, let me know, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video